How many military bases does the USA have around the world outside of its borders? The United States operates approximately 750 or more military bases in over 80 countries and territories around the world outside its borders. These installations serve a variety of purposes, including hosting troops, conducting training exercises, storing equipment, and maintaining readiness for military operations. Key facts. Major bases are located in countries such as Germany, Japan, and South Korea, reflecting long-standing defense agreements since World War II and the Cold War. Europe, Germany, Italy, and the United Kingdom host a large number of bases. Asia, Japan, South Korea, and Guam are central to U.S. presence in the Pacific. Middle East bases in Qatar, Bahrain, and Kuwait support operations in the region. Some facilities are small outposts or radar stations used for intelligence, logistics, or surveillance purposes. These bases enable the U.S. to project power, respond quickly to global crises, and fulfill obligations to allies under security treaties like NATO. While the exact number fluctuates due to closures, new deployments, and realignments, the U.S. maintains the most extensive military footprint in the world. How many of these bases does Donald Trump intend to close down due to the excessive cost and drain on the USA economy? During Donald Trump's presidency, he frequently expressed concern about the financial burden of maintaining U.S. military bases overseas. He argued that some allies were not paying their fair share of defense costs and hinted at reducing the U.S. military footprint abroad to save money. However, Trump did not specify or enact plans to close a significant number of overseas bases outright. I believe he was prevented from doing this by senior military and other vested interests. Trump pushed countries like Germany, South Korea, and Japan to increase their financial contributions for hosting U.S. troops under agreements such as NATO cost sharing. In some cases, he threatened troop withdrawals if countries did not meet his demands, like Germany, where he announced plans to reduce troop levels by about 12,000 personnel in 2020. Rather than closing bases, Trump proposed reallocating troops. For example, in 2020, he ordered a partial withdrawal of troops from Germany, but many of these forces were slated to be relocated to other NATO countries, such as Poland, or returned to the US. No permanent base closures were finalized during his administration. Trump's rhetoric aligned with his America First policy, focusing on reducing U.S. involvement in international conflicts and shifting resources toward domestic priorities. However, structural and bureaucratic constraints, as well as pushback from Congress and the Pentagon, limited his ability to close bases or significantly reduce the overseas military presence. While Trump emphasized the high costs of maintaining bases overseas and advocated for allies to shoulder more of the burden, his administration did not close a substantial number of bases. Most changes involved troop reallocations or renegotiating cost-sharing agreements rather than base closures. Why does the USA arm Israel to continue their general's plan for a greater Israel, when for lasting security of Israel would be better served by Israel treating those in its occupied lands decently and making peace instead of never-ending wars? The United States provides military aid to Israel for a variety of strategic, political, and historical reasons, but the question of whether U.S. support aligns with Israel's long-term security interests or encourages peace is a matter of intense debate. The U.S. views Israel as a key ally in the Middle East, providing a foothold in a geopolitically vital region. The relationship is rooted in mutual interests, including counter-terrorism, intelligence sharing, and opposition to hostile states like Iran. Why is Iran considered as hostile when it is Israel and their allies who have caused instability in the Middle East with their expansionist desires? Israel's perceived military strength is seen as a stabilizing factor against adversaries in the region. However, Israel's military strength has weakened considerably because since October 7th, Israel's objectives were to eliminate Hamas and return their hostages, yet has failed on both of those objectives. Also, its act of desperation in starting a war with Lebanon and Iraq and Iran and Yemen has also failed, meaning that Israel is in fact defeated. They control the air, deliberately targeting civilians, but losing when met with armed resistance on the ground. Neither Hamas nor Hezbollah have been eliminated. The US and Israel have cultural and political ties, with many Americans supporting Israel as a democracy in a region dominated by authoritarian regimes. Some, however, might argue that Israel is an apartheid state and therefore not a proper democracy. Also, they violate and ignore all laws of war and humanity and are charged with committing genocide in Gaza by the ICJ. Historical ties, including sympathy after the Holocaust and shared Judeo-Christian values, play a role in solidifying this bond. Again, I disagree when hospitals, mosques, churches, civilian homes, as well as reporters, aid workers, medical staff, and more are deliberately targeted and killed. Also, blockading aid deliveries of food, water, medicines is a war crime, is it not? Strong lobbying groups such as AIPAC influence US foreign policy. Bipartisan support for Israel in Congress reflects the influence of religious, cultural, and political constituencies. The US provides approximately $3.8 billion annually in military aid to Israel, largely under a 10-year Memorandum of Understanding signed in 2016. The aid allows Israel to maintain a qualitative military edge over regional adversaries. This is no longer true anymore. While US aid bolsters Israel's perceived military dominance, critics argue that this approach perpetuates a cycle of violence, undermining long-term peace and stability. I believe they are right. Since the 1967 Six-Day War, Israel has occupied the West Bank and East Jerusalem, controlling the lives of millions of Palestinians without granting them full civil rights. In fact, Israel ignores their civil rights and actively mistreats them. Expanding settlements and unequal treatment fuel resentment and violence, creating instability and international condemnation. Some Israeli leaders and factions support the annexation of more territory, which they view as fulfilling a biblical or nationalist vision. Critics argue that this expansionist approach is unsustainable and prevents peace. Many experts and peace advocates believe that Israel's security would be better served by negotiating a two-state solution, treating Palestinians as equals and addressing their grievances. Israel totally opposes this. Persistent military campaigns, blockades, and settlement expansions are seen as obstacles to peace and sources of ongoing conflict. Critics argue that unconditional US support, including vetoing UN resolutions critical of Israel, enables policies that harm Palestinians and delay peace. Some believe US leverage could be used to pressure Israel into pursuing a negotiated settlement, which could lead to greater regional stability. Advocates for peace suggest that treating Palestinians as equals, granting civil rights, and ending the occupation are essential for Israel's long-term security. Peace agreements would reduce hostility, making Israel less reliant on past military strength. A viable Palestinian state alongside Israel is widely viewed as the most practical solution to resolve the conflict. This requires significant compromises, including halting settlement expansions and addressing Palestinian refugees' rights. The US could play a more balanced role by promoting negotiations and conditioning military aid on steps toward peace. Encouraging dialogue and reconciliation could reduce the reliance on military solutions. While US support strengthens Israel militarily, many argue that a lasting and secure future requires addressing the root causes of conflict, including the occupation and inequality faced by Palestinians. Peace, based on mutual recognition and justice, would likely provide greater stability than an endless cycle of wars and military dominance. However, achieving such peace depends on both Israeli and Palestinian leadership, as well as the role of international actors like the United States. So the only way to lasting peace is by way of a change in the leadership of the far-right coalition that controls the Netanyahu government. A change in leadership or policies in the Israeli government, including the far-right coalition under Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, could be a significant step toward lasting peace, but it is not the sole determining factor. Peace between Israelis and Palestinians requires comprehensive efforts on multiple fronts: political, social, and international. Netanyahu's government, particularly its far-right factions, supports policies such as expanding settlements in the West Bank, opposing a two-state solution, and maintaining a strict blockade on Gaza. These policies make negotiations difficult and exacerbate tensions. Members of the coalition, including figures like Itamar Ben-Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich, have advocated annexation of parts of the West Bank and other measures that Palestinians and many in the international community view as provocative. The far-right coalition's rhetoric and actions have been linked to increased violence in the region, including settler attacks on Palestinian communities and military crackdowns on protests, even inside Israel. The current government's ideological base largely rejects the compromises needed for a two-state solution, such as withdrawing from settlements or sharing Jerusalem as a capital. A leadership change could open pathways to peace, but the impact would depend on the new government's policies and willingness to engage in genuine negotiations. Governments led by centrist or left-wing parties, such as those in the past, for example Yitzhak Rabin's Labour government, have been more open to negotiating with Palestinians and pursuing peace agreements. A shift away from far-right policies could halt settlement expansion, improve conditions in Palestinian territories, and rebuild trust in the peace process. The problem here is that the far-right settlers would have to be forced off their illegally occupied lands, which could result in a civil war inside Israel. A new government could be more responsive to domestic and international calls for peace, especially if public opinion in Israel shifts toward a more conciliatory stance. Progress would also require effective and unified Palestinian leadership willing to negotiate in good faith. Divisions between Fatah in the West Bank and Hamas in Gaza complicate peace efforts, not as much as Israel's refusal to even consider a peaceful solution. While leadership is crucial, lasting peace requires addressing structural issues and fostering mutual trust. Peace hinges on ending the occupation of Palestinian territories and addressing key issues such as borders, refugees, settlements, and the status of Jerusalem. Civil society initiatives on both sides that promote dialogue, understanding, and cooperation can help build support for peace from the ground up. The US, EU, and other international actors could play a balanced and active role in facilitating negotiations and ensuring both sides meet their commitments. Any agreement must ensure security for Israelis and Palestinians, as mutual distrust and fear of violence often derail peace efforts. While a change in Israel's far-right leadership could create a more conducive environment for peace, it is not the only factor. Both Israeli and Palestinian leaderships must commit to compromise, and broader societal, regional, and international efforts are needed to address the deep-rooted issues driving the conflict. Leadership change could act as a catalyst, but lasting peace will require sustained efforts from all parties involved.